So are we just
All right, I think we are live. Sorry, what was the question?
So yeah, just gonna give an introduction, then we can start all the claims and stuff.
Yes, exactly. So, welcome to Juggling Lessons. This is a vanilla SE session today with Jordan. And Jordan is showing us a blank screen today for anonymous reasons. Let's see. Jordan, would you tell us the claim you have in mind?
Well, it's very interesting juggling. I've been looking at many different types of what is power, and when we look at society as a whole, if I were to make a claim just based on my research, I would argue that power is knowledge. That knowledge, the more knowledge that someone has, can be equipped in how we see the powerful. And I think in order to order this, we need to examine the questions. What exactly does it mean to be powerful? And I think that that question really resides in the fact that
I think we're now into the reasons. I think
yeah,
the statement is knowledge is either equal to power or knowledge is coincident with power or has a very strong causal relationship with power. Is that
yeah,
correct?
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so knowledge is power. That would be the claim. Let me see if this thing's working. All right. And how confident are you that this is the case, that knowledge is power?
I mean, there's a variety of different aspects to it, but I'd say I'm familiar. I'm not. I'm new to the subject, so I don't know. So I'm semi-confident in it. Yeah.
Semi-confident. So is that 60? Just a little
Yeah.
more than
So just
50-50? Okay,
if you want to
very good.
identify levels of confidence levels, then yes.
Yeah, and we don't have to be anything like precise about that kind of thing. All right, so this is a bit of a definitional claim. Right now, if I just take knowledge as power, I want to bend over backwards and accept your definition. So could you describe in what way knowledge is equal or equivalent or leads to, or what's the relationship between the two if they're not exactly the same meaning?
Well, when I talk about knowledge is power, I'm referring to the societal context, which we use the word power, in which when we generally think of power, I would say knowledge is equal to power, but power is something different entirely, as it powers the ability to influence other people in making their decisions, or having
Okay.
influence over people.
Okay, so power is equivalent to social influence.
Well, there's many
Would
different
that be
types of influence. Not all of them are social. Like
sure?
there's hard power, like how we have over the military, and then there's different things like socioeconomic power. We have like different inequalities that
Okay,
translate to different minority groups.
so there's a bunch of different ways to look at power, and not all of them qualify as social. All right, but power is the ability to force other people's choices.
Yeah, or strongly
Or
influence.
strongly influence. Yeah. So that's a sliding scale. Okay. And then knowledge is knowledge the ability to force other people's choices?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I'd say if we were going to look at it more ontologically, knowledge is just having the ability to. It gets tautological sometimes, but knowledge is basically the ability to know things about reality, or not
Very
know
good.
to know things about reality, but to have things in your mind that correspond with reality.
Okay. So knowledge is the ability to have a model of reality that makes future testable predictions that are mostly reliable.
Yeah, that
Yes.
correspond with reality.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that seems like there is some space between knowledge and power, but that knowledge very much leads to power. Does power lead to knowledge? And would I be correct that knowledge leads to power is the relationship?
No, you can be born in a society, like you can be born into a rich household and still have power. It's just that
Mm-hmm.
if you were to attain more knowledge, more power, the way you do that
Mm-hmm.
is through knowledge.
Okay.
Like,
So knowledge leads to power. Getting more power doesn't give you more knowledge, but the means to more power is more knowledge.
correct, yeah.
Okay, very good. Knowledge leads to power then. Would you change the claim to knowledge leads to power? Would that be fair?
Yeah, that'd be fair. Yeah.
Okay, good. Um, okay, so what reasons do you have to believe that this relationship that knowledge leads to power uh, is actually the way power is acquired in the real world?
Well, one of the reasons that I think that is when we're examining society as a whole, we can look at when traditionally when people say the president has the power, the
Hmm.
people at like making the laws have the power, and to an extent, I would actually disagree with this claim to the most to a
Hmm.
most start. Like, yeah, they can make laws and do things for our society, but I would argue it's the scientists, it's the sociologists, it's the people who have these types of influence that actually make their power. Because in a world where we have language, right, and things like that, you can make have being a place in power. But if you can actually influence these people, think when you think about it, our language literally makes up the categories we use to describe ourselves as human beings. If we can have
Ah,
people describe like who we are, what we should value, what things like this like are all determined by these people like who come from more educated backgrounds, then we can say,
hmm,
for instance, that they hold the influence over society or power over society because they are the ones determining like the things that we use to associate
hmm.
ourselves as a distinct culture.
Okay, so the people that write dictionaries or the people that help define what language means for us are the actual ones controlling our choices.
Yes, because they address the most foundational things within our thinking, right?
Okay,
Like
what if
if you
somebody's not doing that? Can they also have power without changing our language?
well, there's a lot more things when you to look into it than just language, for example, right? Like the way
Sorry,
they
we're widening what I'm trying to narrow. I'm looking for the exception to say that is it possible that some power comes from things other than defining language?
well, yeah, there's many different ways
Okay,
you can, yeah, many other things
so
you can do.
defining language is one form of power, and there are other forms of power. Cool. Let's keep going. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think when we're looking at it, I think a really good influence through it is that when you're looking at how the wealthy, or not the wealthy, but the powerful in society organize it, how the powerful rule the lower class of, if you want to call it that. We see it's generally through three methods, which Michael Occult
Hmm.
does Vietnam explain in one of his many books, right? That it's through
Hmm.
surveillance, it's through normalization, and it's through examination. We in the towards the 1700s, right? We can see through
Okay.
the evolution of power through in public executions to today, right? Like in our prism systems, we have
Hmm.
the surveillance aspect. We have guards and cameras
Sure.
looking at
Hmm.
people, and then the normalization. Like
Hmm.
this is what defines you as a prisoner, right? Like you should live to this conduct.
Incarceration. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
like you should do that. And the examination between like, have you been a good prisoner, or like have
Hmm.
you been doing all that stuff? We can see this in many other forms of society. For example,
Hmm.
like when we're looking at the workplace, for example, we see that the surveillance of we have our supervisors and our time schedules and cameras looking over us. We have the
Hmm.
normalization is then the culture that we have to act and feel professional. We have to do for the greater for the good of the organization. And we have to be able, and we have to see that like these organizations, they actually influence a culture on us that we're to abide by a certain standard. And then
Okay.
finally, like for example, we can see that an examination, like, oh, here's some things that you should improve on. Like when people call you to a meeting, for example,
Yes.
they want to examine, say, here's some things that we think that you've been doing wrong and how you can get back on
Yeah.
track. That in terms
Yeah.
of and reason I make this point is I feel like it can extend much broader into general society, right? Like the fact that
What's
we
the it that can extend?
uh,
What's the it
the
that can extend?
extent of of the power infrastructure of society. Like, for example, I gave the surveillance normalization examination, right?
Yeah.
This goes deeper, much
Are there other than those three that are relevant to power?
those are the things that the powerful use to rule the less powerful, right? Because
Do they use anything other than those three? Is there other categories?
I mean, they do use other means, but those are
Okay.
the general
So these are
concepts.
three prominent means.
Yes, yes. Mhm.
Okay. Continue.
Yes, yeah. And the way I tend to look at this is that um, this could be extended even beyond like one's social culture, or not like even beyond the prison system or just the workplace, but maybe into our everyday lives. Because there's
Okay.
people in society to determine what beauty looks like for us. Like if we look in the mirror, we're told that we should look a certain way, that we should be able to conform to society's standards.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the normalization process that we're brought up in, is that we're taught like through social norms
Okay.
that we're taught to conform to a certain standard in society, like, and
I'd like to turn a corner here on this. I've heard a lot of the examples of the conclusion. Here are examples in the categories. Here's how it's done. We've talked about the categories. I appreciate that stuff. It helps me understand where you're coming from. I want to focus on the reasons why you think this is true as compared to the alternative.
well,
You said that there was a writer who wrote a lot about it. So, one of the reasons might be you accept that authority. Do you accept that authority?
I think of Michael Foucault and his works as
Okay.
being really substantial, is because the way he can tie it in through the examples
Okay, so he
into
gives a
how.
lot of examples, and that is compelling, and that's what led you to the conclusion.
Yes, yes, but he all yeah,
Okay.
but some other reasons are that like when he tacks it up against other systematic models, he gives
Mm-hmm.
detailed analysis on how these compare and why this is actually the case. That when you look at society, these are actually the core concepts.
Okay, so you've been convinced by a long series of examples, well stated. That's probably a really good reason to come to a 60% confidence in something. That's a good start, I think. Um, what could you learn tomorrow? Doesn't have to be something that's true. What could you learn tomorrow that would lead you to increase your confidence above 60, that knowledge is the primary thing that leads to power?
Well, I could go into a lot of criminology. I could probably do more research on these issues when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to criminology, or what it means to influence people in
Mm-hmm.
psychology. 'Cause one of the things I've been really fascinated with is the ability for we to change each other's minds. And one of
Okay.
the in one of his books, Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind, influence
Mm-hmm.
actually points out how we're not actually influenced mostly by rationalism. I think that it's
Mm-hmm.
actually more a combination of our emotions that really is what convinces us in society. And
Mm-hmm.
I
I
think,
really appreciate Jonathan Haidt.
yeah,
Sorry,
yeah,
please
he's a
continue.
good author, and I really appreciate
Mm-hmm.
his studies that he does on it. So, just to answer your question, I think
Mm-hmm.
doing more research and reading could increase it.
Okay, so if you did more research and reading and it continued to add to confidence, if the data of that research led to the conclusion that that would raise your confidence, that seems like a really good hypothetical. How about the hypothetical in the other direction, something that could reduce your confidence, maybe down past 50%? That knowledge is the primary or the most important means to power.
I think the job for any skeptic or for any side of person when influencing,
Mm-hmm.
looking at our decisions as a general, I think it works both ways. I think more knowledge could actually be detrimental to what I believe in. Because if I can know more things about philosophy, metaethics, and things like that, I can start to have more source information to challenge my beliefs. Like, it's one, I think another claim, or one of the things I really believe in, is that we should always look to disprove what we believe in,
Mm,
right? Yeah,
mm,
yeah,
mm.
right. So we
Yes,
can have,
yes, yes. Karl Popper. Yay!
yeah, 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 yeah. We should always be able to if we just look for things that confirm our beliefs, we're just going to be a confirmation bias rabbit holes. Like
Hmm.
one of the things that social media does, right, is that
Yes.
it allows us to just be in these echo chambers where people agree with us and things like that. And I think it's very interesting social psychology how we generally have friends and relationships with people who are similar to us, right? And
Hmm.
I think that we should broaden our scopes when looking at relationships or people in general, because if we have a greater sense in life, like it goes back all the way to I believe Plato or Aristotle, the
Hmm.
unexamined life is not worth living. But yeah, it's just
Yeah,
from there.
I'd love to examine that claim. Yeah,
Yeah.
because I don't know, could we come up with an example of an unexamined? Sorry, that would be a different show. So avoid it. That's too tasty. My feedback
Ooh.
for you. Go ahead. You first.
Oh, no, you may go. You may go.
Okay, my feedback for you. I think, as I said, you're um, being convinced to a 60% is very reasonable given the kind of input that you've been talking about. I would be very interested if you keep me up to date as you learn any new things, whether it moves you up or down. I'm very interested in this topic. So if anybody ever changes their mind or learns new things, I want to be kept in the loop. I like that. I like that. Thank you. Your engagement with hypotheticals is spot on. It seems very reasonable that those be the kind of things that should shift your confidence up or down. So 2 thumbs up, A plus. Thank you. Thank you for their claim. I hope I've understood your claim well enough that this is a knowledge leads to power, and the three primary categories where that happens is surveillance,
Normalization and
and
examination.
normalization, where we say we try to make move people's Overton windows to where they would no longer react to something that they used to react, that kind of thing. That's normalization, yes?
It's basically how it's just the standard that we use to uphold people. Like, for
Yeah,
example, like a student should conduct this set of rules. Like they should raise their hands. They should be able to ask the teacher
sure,
when they want to use the restroom. They
sure.
should.
Set expectations for behavior.
Yeah,
Yeah, totally.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
What is polite? Well, that just depends on what people think in the moment. That fork, this fork. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
completely. Okay, thank you very much. I don't want to hide behind neutrality. Do you have any questions for me on the topic?
Um, I think for you, I don't know what your stances are on the issue, but maybe if I were to ask, what do you think of power? Like, I know Marxists generally
Hmm.
disagree with this statement because, like, they feel it's more of the economic factors, like the rich are the people who hold the
Okay,
power, the
so
bourgeoisie.
they say wealth leads to power, and you would say knowledge leads to power, and wealth makes knowledge a lot more easy. Is that what I hear?
Not necessarily. That is one position you can take,
Okay.
but I think that, but like, there's just different perspectives of looking at the issue.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a lot of things that lead to power. I think there are several uh, political groups these days on the right and the left that want to define terms and hold to definitions of terms and redefine terms as core to their group. If you don't accept this definition of my term, I will reject you for being a whatever you're going to call it. Insert name of outgroup here. Um, so yeah, I think the battle over language, what we call things, is a big battleground. I think it can be a distraction for even bigger battlegrounds, which might be hidden corruptions and machinations between nations and other kinds of things, which have huge, huge power effects, but are able to be kept out of the limelight, especially if we become distracted by politicizing politicizing things that don't serve us, getting very concerned about definitions of things that don't affect our daily lives, like how much effort was spent for and against gay marriage. I'm a big fan of gay marriage, by the way. I'm definitely for it. But what a lot of fight that was, and kind of covered up some other things that were going on at the time that didn't get as much sunlight as we would have wanted them to have. So, yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you. Knowledge leads to power. Yes, I have at least a 60 on that scale. I am inclined to agree with you that the three categories of the methods that you described are amongst my top 10. And I'm very uncertain where I would sort that top 10. Have I answered the question?
Yeah. I think that
Okay.
you have, but I would like to actually ask you a question why you think
Yeah.
that that definitions don't necessarily matter because I think they actually mean a lot
Oh, I
of
think
matter.
they make a lot of difference. I think whether somebody accepts a definition of a term or is willing to accept alternate definitions of the term has a lot to do with whether they're open to new ideas or closed to ideas. If somebody's really, really firm that the old definition or the definition that was 150 years ago was the right one, but 300 years ago wasn't, and the one that's modern is bad, uh, that's usually to me the idea of traditionalism for traditional sake, and rather than just saying, what do we have? What would be the best thing we have right now? I might
Okay.
have gone off on a tangent there. I might not have answered your question.
Oh, it's fine. It's fine. It's
Okay.
just yeah, like it's just that like when considering definitions, I think it's
Hmm.
mainly just what majority think people think because I've always struggled with the question, how do we
Hmm.
define something objectively? I don't know if it's even possible because like when looking at consciousness, what is consciousness? What is a human? What is like
Oh, there's
things
so
like
many questions like that. Yeah. No, like what one of a thing is. Well, one is the number of empty sets there are, and zero is the number of things in it. That's objective, right? It's just a model. Models can be objective. It's objectively true. I can't castle after I've moved my king in the model of the rules of chess. Uh, as far as getting more metaphysically objective, then you start running up against a wall of philosophers who want to be pedantic.
yeah, and you have different other perspectives, like the perception is reality, right? Like, if you have the number one, then like, what does it mean if one is one? If there's no one there to actually say that is one, for example, that the
It can be
language has,
observed later.
huh?
It can be observed later. If I look through a telescope at something 10 billion light years away, I can count one star, maybe one supernova.
Well,
Nobody
take
was
this
there at the
example.
time.
Just take this example. Just pretend that everyone on Earth or everything on
Hmm.
they just died, right? Everyone just died, right? And there's no one there to say that language is even existent or that there's even numbers in the first place, right? Like, do numbers even have meaning outside what we interact with them in the mind? Like, we not give perception to what is one? Like, I think what you're trying to say is that there's
I think
meaning.
numbers are a fiction. I think they are a language. I think they are a special language with special rules so that the results follow conservation, so we can use it for accounting. But that math is just a language like logic, like English, obviously distinct in some important ways.
No, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would tend to agree. It's just that, like, if we ever get to the point where maybe machines can be able to, like, they interpret language, but then we
Hmm.
interpret what they get out of their language, right? Like,
Yep.
we, in a
Yep.
sense. So it really means, like, who has the ability to define language or who can give them meaning is some things I've definitely struggled with myself.
Okay. Is this a good time for us to open to the room? Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that.
FK, do you know, has anybody put any chat messages in the text that we should address first? And then we can also open up the room to people who'd like to supply video.
It seems that you guys have been very thorough. We don't have many questions. We mainly have
Okay.
comments on the topic and people having read the books you mentioned. The
Nice.
one question maybe I would have is where would the conviction scale be after the conversation and if it has changed during the conversation at all?
Yeah. Is 60 where you think you are still?
Well, I mean, And for me, my epistemology, I don't see things personally on a scale that we can
Hmm.
see like a certain certainty, because I would argue that that process is just purely subjective on how you
Okay.
define things, on how
Sure.
certain you are to certain aspects of certainty. And
Yeah. Subjectively, have you shifted?
um I mean, I think so, yeah, because I've
Okay.
just acknowledged the fact that I need to do more research on the subject, and that
So does that
I
move
may
you up
not
or
be
down?
I think both in the way, because if I can research,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
if I do more
That's
research,
fascinating. Cool.
like usually people's beliefs can either reinforce or be detrimental to what we
Yeah.
believe. And if we actually learn more about what we're actually talking about, I feel like it could reinforce both sides.
Okay. Yes, I see how that works. It's almost like you've put an error bar on your error bar. That's cool.
That's one way to think of it. Yes.
I saw an XKCD comic with that, but that would be too deep. That somebody can look it up if they want to.
We have one
Uh,
question from YouTube.
yes, yes, please.
Thinbox Dictator asks, juggling
Hmm.
lessons, do you think English
Hmm.
is logical?
English is logical, partially. I think English is illogical in some regards, and if people are careful in the way they speak, they can avoid the vague, but they have to be very careful to do so. And then most of the time, if they've gone through that much effort, they shift to math or symbolic logics. Okay, that's my answer to Thinbox. Thank you for that comment. Uh, Anybody else may unmute and check their video out.
I mean,
And go
I've
ahead.
always found this issue fascinating, because isn't it language that makes up logic in the first place? Like, I don't think we can talk about things
Yes, I
without,
agree.
yeah, because it's kind of like a
I agree. Logic is a language with constraints, the very similar constraints to arithmetic.
I think my point goes deeper than that, is that
Okay.
logic itself, like when we're describing terms, that we have to use logic in the form of language in order to communicate what we mean by certain syllogisms,
Yes.
right? Yes. So
Yes.
I don't really get the question, is language logical? Because like it depends on what you mean by that, in a sense, because language makes up logic, if you sense, because logic is a kind of a language in and of itself, but we use
Sure.
like descriptive terms from English or Chinese in order to describe that language of logic. So
Yes.
it's kind of like a precursor of logic itself. Because
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
Language is definitely a precursor to logic. I'm a fictionalist regarding math and logic. I think these are things we made up, and we carefully constrain them to match with what we observed in the world, until it almost seems like they can model the real world perfectly if you just squint and hold your eyes just right.
Interesting. I see. Okay.
Anyway, if nobody else has any further commentary, we had, I think you also had a list of questions that you wanted to address the audience with, and we have something like 20-25 minutes left in the hour if we want to go that long.
Okay.
Care you to present your questions, and people may unmute and talk and be cacophonous and throw chairs.
Well, one of the things that I've always questioned, I haven't really done a whole bunch of research into it, is I always wonder, why do we punish someone for a crime? Like, think about it, right? Like when we're going through school, like there's capital punishment where we'll punish someone for doing something that we deem to be wrong. But is that just the basic criteria of why we ought to punish someone? Like it always makes, if like for example, when we send someone to jail or going someone to seemingly punishment, I would like to ask, what exactly do we deem as punishment? Because like if you define it as pain, like not to get into specifics, obviously, but there's some forms of like sex where people deem punishment as something beneficial, and so pain is not always a precursor of punishment. And so I've always wondered if it's how do we define this, and why do we punish people in the first place for things we deem are unjust?
Is it? I'd like anybody else to answer before I dive in.
Well, do we have anyone here besides like the two of us?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because like
Yeah,
someone
right
might
now
go,
there's 7 people in the room. One of them is my production people, so there's 6 people who could talk. Oh, Fanny says she's muted. FK, could you? Okay. So people are not able to unmute. This might be a situation where we have to do something about permissions and then have you leave and come back into the room. So, FK, let me know when I should tell people to leave and come back and try that.
someone just joined, and someone just joined now. So
Yep, that's Shoulder to Crayon, my wife, who's also on the production team.
oh, awesome.
So she just checked that she could join unmuted. So if you dump out of the room and come right back, you should be unmuted.
Oh, okay, that's good that we got that sorted out. Yeah, because we have the guest chat. Are you guys good now? Oh, they still seem to be muted, even with that. Hello, Little Real Reading. How are you?
Hey, Redding.
Hey, man.
So I look forward to hearing from your commentary. And you can throw video. If you throw video, I'll back out of the video myself so that I don't get bandwidth swamped.
No, I don't need video. I actually, to tell you the truth, I didn't hear. I came in the middle, so I'm not exactly.
Mm-hmm. The guest just asked a specific question that was away from the Elenchus. So this is kind of a new topic while we fill out the hour. And that is, what is the motivation for incarcerating people, if not that we hold them responsible for their actions because we assume that they have free will? Did I get that right?
More or less of why do we punish people at all, like in society? Like we generally do it for a variety of reasons, but if there's any criteria that we could use to say we should punish something for some particular event.
Well, when it comes to the correctional facility or the correctional system, I've always personally haven't liked the idea of punishment, more rehabilitation. Though I will admit that a lot of people do see going to prison as a form of punishment. You broke dad's dish, so now you got to go to your room type thing. It's like but personally, I see it as being highly flawed because it's led to a lot of problems in society and doesn't really do what it's supposed to do. So if you look at at like prisons and stuff like that as a form of removing someone from society that's a danger to society, and B, as a way to really rehabilitate them to so they can then re-enter society, then I think it works. But unfortunately, the overwhelming view of the prison system, it has nothing to do with rehabilitation. It's all about punishment, and hence it's led to all the problems like the public acceptance of mistreatment of criminals, and then even when someone gets out of jail, they're still a part of that system and ultimately end up going back to jail.
Well, if I were to ask you on that, I think maybe people may be assuming from the first place, because I'm not too knowledgeable on the subject, does punishment actually lead to rehabilitation within participants? Like, for example, when we spank a child for misbehaving, is that supposed to be able to be some form of be able to reincarcerate them to behave better in the future? Like go ahead.
I was that would be, yeah, there some people do hold the beliefs that a negative stimulus kind of reinforces the a proper behavior. So it's fear based, do what you're told or otherwise you face these consequences. And a large part of society is built on that. If you speed, you get a fine. If if you serve a minor, you lose your liquor license. It's crime and punishment. Um, it's just personally, I don't see. I think punishment has a place, but it's not the only tool we should be using.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, yeah. It's I think that I agree with you on an aspect. I think more or less if it does facilitate that type of behavior, I think then the question really goes down then is it really a negative in aspect of negative incentivization? Does it actually incentivize people to make change? Is more the broader issue, which I think can only be done with research and people who are more knowledgeable in the statement. But from what I've gathered, there are two forms of basic motivation, which you outlined, right? Like giving people a speeding ticket. There's like intrinsic rewards and there's extrinsic factors, but there's also things like deterrence that do motivate human behavior. But like when we're talking about extrinsic things, I think those things would qualify as extrinsic things because they revolve like taking away money or things like that, in order to incentivize human behavior. But maybe I would think that if we are for the most part motivated by intrinsic behavior, we ought to like incentivize prisoners to do it not because they are forced to, but because they want to, in a sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
It's like the only thing is how do you do that in a public sphere where we have our prison system, or just when you think about it, like I think that's one of the things I was bringing up normalization earlier, how society conforms people to act in a certain set of values. And when you think about it, criminals are just people who do not uphold to that expectation, right? There are people, that's why like when you see on Netflix shows or podcasts, they're extremely popular because criminals, we kind of have these people who are disobeying society. They're going against what we deem and what we value. And I often feel it's kind of a negative trait that we tend to disassociate them. Said, oh, they're different people. They're people like they're supposed to act like us, right? And I think that barrier between the criminals and us is really a dividing force that maybe the people in power use to relinquish us from the rest of society. In a sense, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think everyone has a desire to rebel, to buck social norms. It's, I would imagine it is it's more popular in the Western culture with our individualistic ways of looking at the world. We see ourselves as individuals rather than part of a collective. Um, so if if you look all the way back to the 50s with Rebel Without a Cause, or if you look at Robin Hood, if you look at like all pop culture, there has always been a romanticism of going against social norms.
Interesting. Yeah, I find that I find this entire thing fascinating because like up until like in terms of our prison system, up until like the 1600s, the main way that we had like put criminals on trial is through public executions, right? And that form of public executions, in a sense, was a form for, people to learn in a form of deterrence. But I think now that, like, just as you outlined, right, one of the things that has changed over society in the last couple of decades, or like centuries, if you put it, is that like the privatization. What I mean by that is that like we put prisoners in a way that they're concealed from the public, that they don't know about the things. Because one of the things that led to like a lot of protests is that you have this, like, just like you said, like these victimized criminals, and the public actually likes these criminals. That may put some question into the authority of the government, which may be detrimental in a sense. It really goes back. Go ahead for the real reading.
Agreeing.
Yeah. If that, I think we're done with this question.
I had
Juggling left.
one little point to make, if maybe it's helpful.
Please, I'm glad to see you're unmuted. That's good.
Yes.
We worked that out. Thank you.
As a parent, I'm particularly interested in this question because obviously you want to do the right thing, and that's going to most help your kids. And it struck me that as I was pondering how to parent my kids, the ways that are suggested by various experts kind of correspond to what we do in prisons or whatever, or in the justice system. So I found it helpful to break it down into mostly four, and you can think of others too, but 4 types. So there's punishment, which you've hinted at, but I don't think anyone called it out, that punishment is generally the sense of we have to do justice to you for the wrong that you did. And it might be, from a Judeo-Christian standpoint, this is just for you to suffer because you did this wrong.
Justice motive?
And
would that qualify? Justice motive?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Keep going.
So it's not about having an effect at all, other than just this is right. We have to do this because this is right. And then and you can do that to your kids as well as to criminals. Then you have number 2. I had chastisement, which I think of as a action you take against a wrongdoer to try to get their attention, to try to teach them what's right, to try to show them the folly of their actions so that they can straighten up and fly right. Not so much rehabilitation, so much as teaching, right? It's not that they really knew the wrong thing, and I think it is
teaching, or that's distinct from chastisement, distinct from rehabilitation, distinct from teaching?
I think that I'm lumping these together to try to explain what I mean by chastisement. Like,
okay, good.
The kid reaches for the fire, maybe you whack their hand a little bit. Well, that's not a punishment so much as you're trying to like get their attention and get them to wake up and realize this is serious. And those two have, you can argue about how successful they are. I think you've already discussed how unsuccessful the deterrence aspect of it is. Chastisement is a little different than that. But then I think of discipline, which is more along the lines of consequences or actions you take against a wrongdoer to as an ongoing way to kind of train them to do the right thing. So I think of it as different than chastisement in that it's not an immediate thing that you're hoping gets their attention. It's a longer term thing that you're trying to instill in them discipline, much like the army in boot camp might punish a disobeying private with push-ups and KP. It's so that they can learn discipline. And then, so those two are kind of related. And then the fourth one, I just usually label consequence, which is showing people or highlighting or emphasizing the natural outcome of their action. And I try to do this with my kids when they're babbling, yelling, not using proper voice at the dinner table. Well, the consequence is you have to leave the dinner table. You can't sit with the family for a time. Yes, it's me as the authority dispensing that as a consequence, but it's also the natural consequence in life. If you're annoying and loud and don't follow social norms, you get kicked out of the social group. And so hopefully I'm teaching in the right way, and that's so you can argue about which of these ways are effective. And I wonder what our justice system does of these four. It doesn't seem to really do any of them well.
Oh, I think it's great at vengeance. I think it just
at vengeance. Yeah, I didn't mention vengeance because hopefully you're not taking vengeance out on your kids.
I think justice and vengeance are a matter of degree and a matter of opinion when you cross from one to the other. Especially if you have made sure, if you have the notion that people get away with most crimes, and so when we do catch a crime, we should punish it enough to create a big deterrent. Justice can merge right into vengeance. Making an example of someone, for example.
Yeah, that line does seem blurred, doesn't it? And I'm struggling with, anyway. like with all the talk about capital punishment and punishments for drug offenses and so forth. Like it seems like the deterrent effect of prison time is really, really poor.
Yeah, and there's multiple aspects on it. Some people could argue that it actually maybe reinforces them to go back to prison if it destroys their lives after they can't get a job. They're less likely to get a job afterwards. So after going to prison because of like the employer seeing their track record and other things like that. But I think one aspect I'd like to ask you on it is, if I may, is that two things. Is that one, and like in one of the things in Plato in the Republic he tries to address is, what even is justice, and how is it from your perspective? How can we identify it? And two, when does the line between, like as we addressed, between abuse and punishment become that? How do you identify that? Because I feel like for a lot of individuals, right, like there's a difference between punishing your child and abusing your child. And I think one of the things I've tried to struggle with is, where does that become too much? Like, for example, I would say maybe like giving your kid a slap on the wrist is different from hitting them with hitting them with a hammer in the head, right? And like breaking open their head, I think there's probably a difference between the two.
Yeah, I
yes.
coming to believe like punishment, there's very little, perhaps no place for punishment from adults to their kids. I don't see that it works. I don't see that it's healthy. The other three that I mentioned may be more appropriate, but then that makes me think, well, if there's no place for punishing, like literally punishing, like this is the just thing, I am this dispenser of justice. I have the authority under God to punish you. If I'm not even going to do that to my kids, maybe I should not also want it in society. I don't know. That's a hard one.
I think you probably cut your kids a lot more slack. But and that's good.
If you stop that strictly defined punishment, if you no longer do that to your kids, then you have to be better on the other three that I mentioned.
Yeah, that's very true. It's not an easy question. I'm not sure I have great answers. I tend to think of punishment maybe in a larger sense than maybe the narrow thing that you were describing, as amplification of the natural consequence of a thing. I know you went in the car and you heard the brakes squeak and nothing happened, but I'm going to make sure you hurt a little bit so you remember that if this hurts a lot, maybe it won't even hurt at all. And that's extra bad. Something like that.
Yeah. That's, to me, that's not strictly punishment. That's a different kind of thing.
Right. So we get into these
Yeah.
definitions, and it has to do with what's our goal, what goal is being served, and what limits are we putting on it. And I think those limits that we would deal with in the case of children are very different than what society deals with in the case of criminals. And so, boy, I just know that I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we use the language like, you ought to pay for this crime. Who are you paying by staying a year in jail or in prison? You're not
The wages
paying
of sin
anyone.
are incarceration. Yeah.
I mean, I don't really. I mean, it's a metaphor at best. It's not real.
Pay your debt to society. Yeah.
Right.
He's paid his debt.
Oh yeah, society's so much better off now that he was in prison. I mean, it might be
Yeah.
better off in that he's removed from society and can't commit further acts. But
I have a friend who taught me to dive and clean boats, and he had spent 12 years in prison on a life sentence. And I didn't ask him for what, but I'll let you fill in the details of what somebody gets a life sentence for. And he managed through very good behavior and showing that on his own, he sort of rehabilitated himself. I mean, I suppose to a degree, he was able to get some resources while he was in toward that end, but he really he very much showed it for himself. So he's an example where half-hearted efforts at rehabilitation worked because he was motivated, and I do trust him, and I think he's a great person, and I don't know if he's paid his debt to who, for what, but I'm okay with it.
yeah, I mean,
So,
debt is the realm
He
of
might be
the
one of
civil
those.
court.
Yeah, exactly. That should be a civil thing, not a criminal.
We have wrongful death for that, or whatever other tort you might bring.
Yeah. And again, I haven't ever asked him because it wasn't relevant. I didn't think that knowing what it was he was convicted of would let me know anything that I needed to know. Anyway, we have just a few more minutes if we want to, if there's further questions somebody would like to bring. And otherwise, I appreciate you all for coming to this. This is our first live stream. And does anybody have anything further, or are we done and I'll see you on another day?
I feel like this was really fun so far, just looking at a lot of different aspects of like what even like through power and justice and things. I think it's really important that we examine these things in society, not just take things for granted, because that's how like things like totalitarianism form, when people don't question what the society they're being into, right? Like when we saw after World War II, during the cases of the Nazis, a lot of them weren't these, like smart, evil geniuses that we often portrayed them to be. They were normal individuals who were just carrying out a plan set by the society they were put in, right? And, I think in this sense, we ought to look at our certain state of affairs and look where we've gone wrong and really try to fix the issues, kind of what we're seeing in the present day with systematic racism and how we're trying to reform society.
Thank you for that. Any further feedback? These are a few of my favorite street epistemology related channels on YouTube. I'll probably populate this list with about another 8 or so that I have in mind. And if you're very interested in what street epistemology is all about, there are a lot of really good resources at the website provided by Street Epistemology International. That is streetepistemology.com. Thank you very much for Jordan and for all of the rest of you joining me today. I've enjoyed this conversation very much, and I look forward to having more of it again. If you would like to be a guest on this show, mostly be willing to show your face and bring any one of 8 different categories. If you look on the introduction videos, there's a playlist talking about the 8 categories of shows we're going to do on here. If you have something that fit into any of those categories, I look forward to hearing from you.